Buckle up, Buttercup. Rex Bear Leak Project. How the heck are you? Beautiful day today. And as you can see, we've got the man, the myth, the legend, Paul Wallis with us. Wow, Paul, you have been all over the place. You've been traveling to Turkey, uncovering incredible artifacts out there and the megalithic sites. You've uncovered a plethora of information through the biblical texts and the scriptures. Being a former pastor, I think you're a pastor for like 33 years, right?
Yeah, that's right. 33 years, man and boy.
Wow. What an iconic number, 33. Like not 32, not 34, but the 33.
It's funny. I do mention this from time to time that I was in church-based ministry for 33 years. And of course, I immediately get comments that are interpreting that and say, this must mean this. Yeah, you must be Illuminati. You must be in the Freemasons. And no, it's just a fact. It's just a fact. Between 1985 and 2018, I was in church-based ministry, a theological educator, a church doctor, and an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. So that's just the history.
That's cool. And if you're Illuminati, you're like natural Illuminati because you didn't even have to sign any contracts. You're just illuminated naturally, which is pretty cool. Like 33 is a powerful number. And I find it fascinating sometimes when you look into events that take place and the dates and the numbers and stuff, you can follow that rabbit hole and it may never.
Well, I tell you what the number meant for me, in all honesty. 33 has been a significant number for me, really, because when I turned 33, I had this really deep feeling that I had completed a lifetime, that I now needed to be much more intentional about the next lifetime I was going to live. And I actually changed my middle name at that point to mark what I felt was this real pivot in my life. And I did make some really deep personal decisions to live more intentionally. And I changed my life up for the next chapter. And then when I came to the end of my season in church-based ministry and realized it was 33 years, that just made me feel good because I felt that I had given a lifetime to this form of ministry and that it was actually a good thing and a right thing to let my work and my ministry shape up completely differently moving forwards. It kind of gave a closure on that chapter for me. So that's what the number means to me.
That's so cool. Yeah, I look at it as apex. Like that's the top of the pyramid. That's the pinnacle, 33. That's a very powerful number. So, and as I was saying before, like you can follow those rabbit holes where you're like, wow, why did this event happen on this day or this date? And I think a lot of times it might just be, I don't know if there's such thing as coincidence, but it seems like there's oftentimes things behind the scenes, like spiritual aspects that makes itself known through numbers sometimes. Possibly.
I agree. There are lots of ways in which the universe gets our attention. And I think patterns of numbers is one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you just got to step back and be like, okay, that's the number. But anyway, super cool. And I really appreciate that. I've always wanted to bring that up to you. And so I'm glad we talked about that. So we talked a couple years ago, and folks, we're going to really focus on the Eden Enigma today and the research that Paul is doing out there in Turkey, these incredible archaeological sites and discoveries and the connections to other civilizations. It's just mind-blowing, absolutely incredible. But one of the first things I wanted to ask you is in reference to the last interview that we did, great interview, and we need to do these more often if you get the chance. I know you're super busy.
Oh, for sure. Rex, I would love to.
Right on. Thank you very much. Was you had mentioned something about Yahweh and Reptilian? Am I remembering that right? Because when you said that, I was just so blown away that I didn't even get a chance to ask, like, how did you get that information? What does that exactly mean? That's wild.
Well, the short answer to that question, where did I get that information? The answer is the Bible, in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament. And Yahweh is a word that can be very confusing for people because if you read later on in the Hebrew scriptures, the minor prophets, they will use that word when they are thinking about God, as we would understand God, when they're thinking about the source of the cosmos or some transcendent kind of being, they will often use that word. But in the earlier scriptures, where Yahweh is not an idea, where Yahweh is not the ideation of God, you will find that Yahweh is a flesh and bone character, moving around, interacting with people, and doing stuff. And in those texts, he is clearly physical in many, many instances. He, for instance, can be calmed, pleased, sedated with certain smells. And so certain types of incense or burnt cattle or burnt rams, if brought into his presence, it gives him great pleasure. And that tells you straight away we're dealing with something physical. It makes him very similar to other Elohim that are mentioned in the scriptures. So, for instance, in Bel and the dragon, which is a suffix to the book of Daniel, we hear about an Elohim, a powerful being who was governing over the Babylonians. And they had to appease that Elohim in the same way, with certain types of smoke, burnt rams, burnt sheep. In battle, often Yahweh demands certain tribute, and it's physical tribute. And it's very clear, I think this is in Numbers 31, that this isn't going to the priests. The priests have their allotment of these things, and then Yahweh has his allotment of gold and rams and bulls and virgin girls. Now, God, the source of the universe, does not need to be supplied with those things. God, the source of the universe, doesn't need to inhale certain things in order to get his call back. And in fact, the scriptures go further and they give physical descriptions of Yahweh. Now, there's a very famous incident where the people of Israel are required to bow down to an image to prove their allegiance to Yahweh. If they don't, then they're all going to die because of the fiery serpents that have bitten them. And they have to bow down to this image, which is of a serpent or dragon. And the logic of that story is that they are kowtowing to Yahweh. They've been given a commandment not to bow down to the image of anyone else, but they have to kowtow to Yahweh in order to be saved. And he's referenced there as a serpent or dragon. And then in other scriptures, you can go to the book of Job, for instance, you can go into the Psalms, and we will hear about his snout breathing fire and incinerating people. We will hear about the strength of his hide. You can't pierce it with any conventional weapon. We'll hear about his powerful tail, his wings, his pinions, his flight feathers. And you put all these descriptors together and you have a, what would we call it now? Feathered serpent. Does that sound familiar? Absolutely. Absolutely. Quetzalcoatl, exactly. The Mesoamerican dragons, or Achech, the Egyptian dragon, or the Chinese dragons, which are feathered. And this is an image of powerful beings in the deep past who governed over human beings that are reptilian, but they have feathers. And I find it's just curious to note that, say, 200 years ago, we would read these stories and would say, well, there's obviously no such thing as that, so it must be a metaphor. Now, of course, we have dug up feathered reptilians, and we know that is a real thing. But I think even if we hadn't done that, we should go to these stories where we've got these physical descriptions of Yahweh and other entities like him, and ask, what's the purpose of this text? If this is entirely fictional, A, what purpose does it serve? Why would we make this story up? And B, why do the same physical descriptors occur all around the world, whether we're going to ancient Iran or Guatemala or even into Africa or China? Why these two unlikely attributes combining? Reptilian, feathered, snout, fire, and on it goes. Some of the stories don't make any sense at all if you take them as metaphor or fable. So, for instance, there's a story in Leviticus 10 of the sons of Aaron. Aaron was Moses's high priest. And one day they take in an incense offering to Yahweh, because this is what he likes. He likes these smokes. He likes these smells. But they get the recipe wrong. And so he incinerates them in front of their father. And Moses says to Aaron, don't say anything. I told you he was like this. Get your cousins to get those bodies out of there, and don't any of you show any grief or you'll be incinerated too. Now think for a moment, if that isn't a recollection of something, what would the purpose of that story be? You would think that in those scriptures, the purpose of any text would be to get you to love and worship Yahweh. Well, that story is certainly not going to do that, is it? And if it isn't that, then what is it? And it's the correlations between stories like that and others around the world that make me think, actually, our ancestors experienced something traumatic. They're all telling the same story. And I think we should give these stories more respect to stand on their own and take them seriously.
You know, it's really interesting that you bring up the connection to the Mesoamerican rituals and fiery dragons and feather dragons, because I was talking about that earlier today. It seems like there's similarities between certain trauma-based control mechanisms, and that's pretty trauma-based, like what you just said, pure trauma. That, like, you may not want to, but if you see something like that happen, if you want to keep your life, you're probably going to worship and bow down so that you can get out of there without, or show no emotion, like do what you're told. And that's going to put you in line. Wow, that's pretty frightening. And so, like, you said there were older texts that talk about this before the perception changed. Are those like Sumerian or Akkadian? Are those, what are those texts?
Well, certainly, yes. The source of the biblical texts are the Mesopotamian stories. So these are the stories from out of Sumer, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. And the stories of the Elohim in the Bible, the powerful ones in the Bible, many of them are retellings of these much older stories from these other cultures. And when we go to some of those stories, the writers say they're retelling stories that are even older still. So we can go back sort of 6,000 years to when these were being written, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the myth of Adapa and the Enuma Elish. And that takes us a long time back, but those stories are saying, oh no, we're retelling stuff that's thousands and thousands of years old.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the information on the Yahweh connection to the dragon-like figure would be in the Enuma Elish?
Well, as I say, all the draconic imagery is in the Bible itself. That's
in the Bible itself?
Yeah. Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Everything I just mentioned about Yahweh is in the Bible. People miss it because they take it as metaphor. But that's lazy. Just stop and ask, well, what's it a metaphor of exactly? And why would you make that metaphor up? If the agenda of the Hebrew scriptures is to get you to love and adore Yahweh, these stories are actually deeply inconvenient because they show him to be a monster and they show him as reptilian. There has to be another reason for that. And so when you go into Iran, for instance, and see carvings of what their Anunnaki look like, you can't help but wonder, why are they feathered reptilians as well? And the same with the Chinese and the Mesoamerican.
Fascinating. How far back do you think it goes? You think it's like pre-Younger Dryas?
Yes, I think some of the stories that we have in the Bible and in the source narratives from ancient Mesopotamia refer to contact that our ancestors had tens and hundreds of thousands of years ago. I think there have been many times when there have been non-human presences wandering around on planet Earth among our ancestors. And I think as recently as 10,000 years ago, we had an intervention that was actually helpful. There was trauma, which is why we've half forgotten it, but the trauma was of surviving an ice age. And the interventions we had at that time were to help reestablish the human population. But it wasn't the first time we'd been visited. I think we had help about 60,000 years ago as well. And then prior to that, we've got stories that suggest colonization that's less benevolent, where we have visitors who are here for what the planet can offer, and we're their working class. And we've got stories that suggest this, such as in the Popol Vuh, the story from the Guatemalan Maya, who, when they get to the creation of humanity, the feathered serpents say quite openly, let's create human beings to do the unpleasant work and bring us our food. And I think that's part of our deeper story, maybe a couple of 100,000 years ago. So it's many, many interventions, some of which have been helpful, some have been harmful, some of which have brought new technology, such as agricultural science, megalithic building, and others of which has just been exploitative. It's interesting that it's the stories with some trauma in it that seem to overlap from culture to culture, whether you're looking at the stories of the last ice age, or stories of colonization, or stories of reptilian others. There always seems to be this trauma aspect of the shared stories. And I think that's why these stories are a fusion of what we've remembered and what we've forgotten.
Fascinating. Now, with your research and your series, do you think they're from another planet, right? Like, you don't think they're from here, or do you?
Well, let's start off and say that they're non-human.
Okay.
There are stories that make very clear that our ancient tutors were non-human. We've got the physical description, as I was saying before. Another example of that would be the Babylonian story of the Apkallu, where Berossus, the priest who shares this story, which is an ancient Babylonian story, talks about the ancestors of the Sumerians meeting these beings on the banks of the Red Sea. And he describes them as being in appearance like that of a terrible monster. And they can't work out if what they're looking at is a being that lives under the water, or is it semi-aquatic, and certainly not human, and it stinks and it's terrifying to look at, so not human. And plenty of other stories that emphasize the non-human aspect, like the thickness of the hide, the length of the snout, so on and so forth. So non-human, certainly. Among other stories that suggest other kinds of people, if we go to the top end of Australia, listen to ancestral story of the Yolngu people, we will hear about the Mimi, who helped their ancestors adjust to a new environment. And their physicality is described as well, incredibly tall and slender, nothing like a human being. And then in other stories, we have references to where they came from. So there's Native American story, an Aboriginal Australian story, that suggests that our visitors came from the Pleiades, a planet somewhere in the Pleiades. Other story that directs our attention to Sirius, other that points us to Orion, other that points us to Cygnus. And so I think if you've got non-human coming from outer space, it's not too much of a leap to say ET, is it?
Well, clearly not. I have just questioned sometimes whether or not these non-human beings, if they evolved here on Earth, or if they came from another planet. I mean, I'm 50-50 on that. And it does sound like there's a lot of data that suggests these beings came from other planets and other star systems, which is fascinating. Like, you certainly can't prove to me that they didn't, you know what I mean? So I think it's amazing. I'm absolutely blown away with some of these old texts. And I know what you're talking about these, they're kind of called the fish people, and they teach that, I guess it was a lot more barbaric back then, and they give them like culture and government and laws and ideas and stuff. So yeah, and some people have speculated they might be people that were wearing some type of mermaid suits. But now that you're saying that there were records of them smelling bad, then that would change things a little bit.
Yes, yes, I have heard that suggestion. But if a sea lion can tell the difference between a diver's skin and his diving suit, don't you think our ancestors were smart enough to do something similar?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And they got pretty close. They were fascinated by the apparel of these beings, the fact that it seemed to cover all their bodies. So I think they were recognizing apparel for what it was, but it was the morphology of these beings that was different, and the smell of them. And then you've got carvings of beings that look human, but their faces look like birds' faces. Again, you've got to go back and ask why. Why does that recur around the world? That's an odd thing for different cultures to coincidentally dream up. Is it not possible that we're simply being told what people saw? And in a way, it's a red herring as to where these beings originated. The experience of our ancestors was of beings coming from the sky. And so we've got sort of eyewitness versions of this account in a number of cultures. So the book of Genesis begins this way, with a planet that's devastated and flooded and shrouded in darkness. And then something arrives in the sky that's making a wind, a ruach. In the Popol Vuh, we've got the same thing, flooded, dark world. And then the feathered serpents, the heart of heaven, arrive in the sky, making a strong wind. In the Filipino story, again, the Tagalog arrives in the sky and starts clearing land with winds. These are odd ideas to repeat randomly, and you'll find it all around the world. The Enuma Elish begins with the descent of the powerful beings from the sky. We have the vision of Jacob, of course, of the Elohim Malachi, the powerful ones, the messengers coming and going from the sky. So yes, okay, maybe they lived here in the deep past, but if our ancestors said they flew here from the Pleiades, they arrived from the sky, they look nothing like human beings, that's the story they're telling us. We can speculate, but that's the story they're telling us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. It would be so cool if we could find the original texts and date the original texts, because a lot of times the translations get like, you read something out of the Bible and you go back and you read an ancient Sumerian tablet that might have a lot more information on it that's, several thousand years older, but it's a much larger story. I think that's fascinating. And that kind of led you to Turkey, where you're at, where the research you're doing out there.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it did. So my attention was already being drawn in that direction because of so many stories of a reboot of human society that point to the countries that are now Turkey and Armenia, the lands of ancient Armenia. So we've got the biblical story, for instance, that points to the Ararat region and says, oh, that's where Noah's Ark landed. And so there was a reboot of human civilization in that story. We've got the Babylonian story as Yusudra, and his ark lands in the high country in Upper Mesopotamia, in the Ararat region, and there's a reboot of civilization there. If you go into modern day Armenia, that story of a reboot is very close to the surface. In the 5th century of the Common Era, their historian Moses Koranatsai spells all this out and says, this is the history of our region. The progenitor of the people who live here was Haik, who was a descendant of the biblical Noah. And then he fleshes out in the real world the history they know that supports that idea. You can go to the accounts of the gods of the Norse, the Aesir of the Norse people. Listen to the stories curated in the 1200s by Snorri Sturluson, the post-Viking chieftain. And he talks about a migration of an advanced civilization from ancient Armenia into Northern Europe and into Scandinavia and Iceland. And he points here again, Asaland, ancient Armenia. The very name of the region Anatolia, which I'm going there in a few days' time. It'll be my 3rd visit in 18 months. Anatolia, which occupies most of what today is Turkey, means in the ancient language, the place where the sun rises again. And that is the deep story of the region, that there was a climate catastrophe after which humanity had to reboot itself, recover, rediscover agricultural science in order to reestablish as a settled civilized presence on the planet. Just further south than that, you've got another very similar catastrophe and recovery story in the story of Jamshid Yima, which makes its way into Zoroastrianism. So this is the ancient Persian story, not of a flood, as in the case of Noah and Ziusudra, but of a great and terrible winter that the people had to survive. And it's the explanation given for this great web of underground cities built in this part of the world, in Turkey in particular, that we don't really know the origins of these underground cities. We could point to different times in history when they were used, but the Jamshid Yima story says these were created so that our ancestors could ride out a great and terrible winter. And again, we've got story that suggests a cultural memory of the catastrophe of the Younger Dryas Cold period. If you go to Greek story, you've got stories of sky fires, the Bible, and Babylonian, the flood, ancient Persian, the great and terrible winter. These are all the elements we would expect to find if we were looking for human memory of the Younger Dryas Cold period.
You know, we've got people in the chat right now that are actually referencing certain pages out of your book.
Oh,
like
that's
he talks
nice.
about that page 200. He talks about that page 147. So that's pretty cool. You got a really cool following here. So you go to Turkey and then you're at a specific site out there right now, aren't you? Working with Matthew, and you've written extensively about this in your most recent work, the Eden Enigma.
That's right. So the Eden Enigma, which is my latest book, focuses on, there we are, there it is in focus.
Great book, by the way.
It focuses, thank you, on the Van province of Turkey. And in a few days, I'm going to be there with Matt LaCroix. We're leading a tour together of some of the most interesting sites around the Van province. And so those sites are Chavez Tepe, Meher Capi, Ayanus, Kefkalesi. And in those places, we've got the remains of citadels, cuneiform inscriptions, ancient carvings. And part of what we're exploring is the question of how far back do these stories take us? How old are these sites? Who were the first people to build here? We've got a lot of story from the Bronze Age moving into the Iron Age with the Urartian people who lived there. And the latest building that's there is all theirs. But was there anything there before? And what are the clues in the cuneiform inscriptions? And what are the clues in the symbols? And what stories do the symbols tell? And I argue that when we decode the symbols that occur here and across the border into modern-day Armenia, we have a story of ecological recovery that repeats and repeats, and it's referred to in the cuneiform inscriptions of the Urartian people as well.
So these symbols you are decoding to be like extraterrestrial intervention, basically.
Well, yes. I mean, that ultimately is the punchline, that I believe the helpers were extraterrestrial visitors. The language that the Urartian people, they call themselves the Biainili, the language that they used, they didn't have the word ET, they didn't have the word alien, but they did have the word Tingir. And it describes beings whom they name, non-human beings. 47 of them are named at one of the sites we go to, Meher Capi. And the most famous is Haldi. He's in charge of them. And then his consort, they remember her name, that's Alubani. And then there's Teshaba, Suini, Ichuini. They're all associated with the manipulation of the weather. And the story is that there was a time long ago when they lived among our ancestors, but it was a finite period. And they did some technology sharing with us, but it was finite. It was really just agricultural science. And so when archaeologists and antiquarians, historians, anthropologists study ancient cultures, they often distort stories like this by saying, oh, these are the gods of the Urartians. And I think that's completely wrong. the word God implies a transcendent, supernatural, almighty, probably imagined being. That's nothing like the stories the Bianili left behind, who talk about finite beings who were here at a particular and finite time, who helped us in particular and finite ways, and then they left. They weren't almighty. They weren't able to prevent the chaos of an ice age, but they were able to help us to recover in the aftermath. Their physical descriptions are there in the carvings. How they arrived, we can find in paintings across the border in Armenia, paintings that have survived from the Iron Age in Yerevan, at one of the Urartian citadels there. And it's a very, very coherent story. When you look at the carvings of the beings and what they're doing, it becomes clear what the technology sharing amounted to, because you've got beings who look almost human, but not quite. And they are standing next to plants that are not thriving in the wild. They're growing in laboratory-like conditions or greenhouse conditions. And they're holding special equipment with which they are hand-pollinating and cross-pollinating them. Those pictures tell a story of an ecological reboot. Plants have been brought into a new environment. They're being cross-pollinated because new strains have to be created to thrive in the new situation. They're being hand-pollinated because none of the insects that used to do this are present. So it's quite a sophisticated story of what happened in order to provide a food source that could be cultivatable to sustain new cities and a whole new civilization. That's the story that's embedded into the paintings of Yerevan and the carvings of the Van province.
Well, that's pretty cool.
It's very cool because studying this has enabled me to decode something that have puzzled people for a long time, and that's this this pair of symbols that occur in carvings all around the world, the pine cone and the handbag of the gods.
What do you think about those? Yeah, like that's, sorry to interrupt, but those are very important icons. What is your translation?
They are. I think people for a long time have said this has something to do with an upgrade of humanity. And I think it does. And people have speculated as to what the upgrade might have amounted to. But the Urartian carvings are very specific. These were actually the tools that enabled them to reboot agriculture. This tool, whatever it was, is being used for hand pollination. And this is holding something that is poured. It's either liquid or it's seed or it's an emulsion, but this works with this to hand pollinate the plants. Originally, I believe, and I argue for this in the Eden Enigma, we are looking at the tools of the trade of horticulturists who are doing cross-pollination. And I think in later times, this became a symbol of all the upgrade that they gave us, because cross-pollination is the fuse paper. It's lighting the blue touch paper of an explosion that results in civilization. Once you've got this, you've got cultivatable crops. Once you have that, you have farming. Once you have farming, you've got settled communities instead of vulnerable nomadic tribes. Once you're settled, producing surpluses, you can specialize. You can become megalithic city builders, and then you become a city state, and then you can trade with the world. This is the beginning of it. And so I think this is why our ancestors go right back to this moment when these almost human-looking beings are using their tools to create new strains of plant that will set this whole story rolling.
Now, these symbols, are they before or after the Younger Dryas event? As far as when they were carved, do you guys know the date on it?
Oh, well, these were carved after.
Okay.
So, I mean, the particular image on the cover of my book, that's actually from Iran. And it's a bronze to Iron Age image from the palace of Ashur-nasirpal II. So this is, we're talking about the 800s, 700s BCE, when a lot of this art was created. But it's referring to a story that is about 10,000 years old, a story just on this side of the Younger Dryas, on this side of the great and terrible winter when we're beginning to recover.
Have you found anything out there that shows what happened to cause the Younger Dryas? Like what created that?
That's a great question. Yes. I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, when I published Escaping from Eden, the Younger Dryas cold period, people knew it had happened and were looking around for what the cause might have been. And the theory was out there from Professor Richard Firestone of the Clovis comet. And then other scientists have joined in that, and there's much more momentum now to saying, yes, there was a cometary impact. But there may be other aspects to the story as well. I believe we found evidence in the Van province of solar activity that triggered very altered weather patterns on planet Earth. And by solar activity, I'm talking about solar flares, plasma ejections, because we have evidence of basalt structures having exploded. So there are ancient sites. I mean, basalt is one of the strongest things you can build anything out of. How does it get destroyed? Well, in this part of the world, there are earthquakes. Could these structures just have fallen down and been buried in the hillside? Yes. Could there have been a war and the buildings were burnt down? Not really. You wouldn't burn down a basalt structure. What would obliterate a basalt structure to the extent that you're only finding fragments of it in a hillside, such as at Chavez Tepe? And the two aspects that might explain that are electromagnetism, because it's a magnetic stone, that a charge could be created almost like a lightning strike, but on steroids, that is going to have an electromagnetic component to it that can create an explosion. Or you've got plasma ejections where the temperatures are way beyond what you would expect from a lightning strike or from a fire. And we are seeing evidence of that kind of a catastrophe, which then pushes the basalt aspect of the story of the Van province far further back in history to a time when things like that may have been happening. And that may have been tied in with the Younger Dryas. There are, I think it's Anthony Perrott, who's probably the leading expert in terms of the history of plasma ejections. And they have a huge impact on weather patterns on planet Earth, and they could create catastrophes that would destroy megalithic installations.
Could it be artificial? Something like, weapons of mass destruction kind of thing?
Well, of course, that's the Zeus story, isn't it? That Zeus created these sky fires. And I mean, I can certainly understand that people who experienced this kind of catastrophe would look for an explanation and might credit of being like Zeus with having done something like this. These things do occur naturally. And I would not say we've found any evidence of something so targeted as to suggest something by design. Of course, it's possible, but thus far, I think all we're finding is evidence of plasma ejections, which unfortunately is something our sun does do from time to time when it gets a cold.
Yeah. And it seems like there's, you probably have done a lot of research on this also. In Turkey, there's that underground city that's a multitude of levels underground. And one of the modern theories is it was built so that Christians could avoid prosecution. And maybe there's a little bit of truth to that, but it seems like there was a lot more that went into it. It might be a lot older. Like they were going down there, they couldn't be around the cosmic radiation, kind of like what you're talking about.
Oh, exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned that. So Derinkuyu is the famous place in Cappadocia where there's this underground city, 18 stories of underground living. And it's part of a massive network of underground cities. And yes, these places were populated by Christians escaping persecution at different times. At other times, it may have been populated by locals trying to escape the Roman invasion. But how it began, we don't really know. And I mentioned earlier that it is, there's an ancient explanation given by the story of Jamshid Yimar that says it was a great and terrible winter that people were escaping. But what you've just said, Rex, is very relevant, because if we go back 42,000 years ago to the Adams event. Now, the Adams event was a mass extinction event around the world, and it correlated with something called the Lachamps excursion. And that was the time when the North Pole, the magnetic North Pole, moved all the way around to what is now the South Pole, and then moved back. And this took hundreds of years to happen. And you might say, so what? I mean, unless you're navigating the planet using a compass, why does it matter that the magnetic North Pole moves? It matters because of the conditions that allow that. The conditions that allow the North Pole to move are a weakened geomagnetic field. And when that happens, our shield against ultraviolet rays gets incredibly weak. So all the time through those hundreds of years that the North Pole was moving, the surface was being bombarded with ultraviolet rays, which would have meant cancer. It would have meant death for human beings and animals alike. It is the period where all the megafauna of Europe disappears. The elephants, the bears, the lions of France, for instance, vanish. And these are the animals that we see portrayed in the caves, for instance, at Lascaux, which I visited years ago. And this is a period where human behavior changed. And all of a sudden, human beings started living indoors. And when they went outside, they caked themselves in mud because that was their sunscreen. They did both these things because of the Lachamps excursion, because of the bombardment of the surface with ultraviolet rays. So there have been a number of mass extinction events. The eruption of Mount Toba 72,000 years ago was another that impacted the weather to such an extent that you had mass extinction. So these things do happen from time to time that alter our lifestyle. In France, people started living indoors. In Turkey, they started living underground. And there are many cities in Turkey you can visit to this day where you can walk into these places and catch a vision of what it must have been to have lived in these places, and what must the crisis have been for our ancestors to have gone to such an effort to construct 18 stories underground for up to 20,000 people to live in. And that's just one of these cities. Something of seismic proportions was happening.
Did you notice the dates that you're saying, the approximate timeline between each event, even though it was a volcano 70,000 years ago that caused the mass extinction, and the magnetic pole moving about 40,000 years ago, and then go another 30,000 years into the future, you've got about 10, 12,000 years ago, we've got the Younger Dryas event. So we're looking at about 30,000 year intervals here, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, major things every 30,000 years. And then there are other disasters in the meantime. So we've got craters suggesting something happened about 5,000 years ago that was pretty catastrophic. And that was actually Plato's estimate, that every 5,000 years or so, something will happen that will impact civilization to take it to a virtual zero. Well, we haven't quite had that since the Younger Dryas. And I asked the question in the Eden Enigma, why hasn't it happened? Why are we overdue? Is it because we've got more company that's capable of offsetting events like this? It's a speculation. But what I note is that major money around the world, government money and private corporate money, has gone into creating, people know about shelters, for instance, underground shelters that billionaires have in case something happens, others who want the technology to get off planet in case something happens. But something that people might not know is that there are 70 seed banks around the world which have been created in case there is an ecological disaster and we have to recreate agriculture from scratch. And that ties in with what I write about in the Eden Enigma, that suggests that many of our stories of origins really date from the end of the Younger Dryas, when we had to have help to reboot agriculture. And I believe that there are people who have learned from these stories, who are already au fait with what I write about in the Eden Enigma, which is how they've been able to pull together millions and millions of dollars to create these seed banks, to make sure that we're equipped the next time we have a silent spring with no bees, for instance, or another great and terrible winter.
I was looking at the magnetic pole, the way that it's moved the past 200 years approximately. I was looking at the charts that were showing, and it's taken that, it's heading out towards Siberia right now, and it's acting very bizarre. The weather is very bizarre. Back in 2011, I remember there was a lot of news coming out about places in the UK and Ireland that the pavement was basically not boiling, but it was
melting.
The cosmic radiation was causing it to act like jello almost. It was having all sorts of issues. And so in the geoengineering, I think a lot of people have that wrong. We've got cloud seeding going on and stuff, but it seems like there was a while there where there's a lot more spraying going on. And I wonder, there were people that were like, oh dude, it's, they're dropping poison on us. But then the military guys that were coming out quietly, they were saying stuff like, well, they're actually doing it to save your ass, because the magnetosphere is weakening. So they're spraying stuff out there in attempts to block all that solar radiation. And so I'm questioning now, like with all the stuff we're seeing in the skies, I think a lot of it's military and a lot of it's disinformation, but I do believe some of it could be space travelers or visitors from a breakaway civilization. And I just see a lot of signs that parallel stuff. And you talk about that.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting that flight technology and weather manipulation is part of the story of the Tingir in Turkey, and it repeats in other narratives around the world. And I think in the past we've misunderstood it, and we've thought, oh, this is just primitive people who experience thunder and they think there must be a thunder god, or they see the moon and they think there must be a moon god, or there's a monsoon, there must be a monsoon god. And then every time we come across an ancestral story that talks about weather, we put it into that box. And I think that's not true. I think that's a distortion of the stories. I think the Tingir were doing similar to what you were describing, where they may even be cloud seeding, they may be spraying stuff in the sky using their flight technology, but it's actually not part of a story of poisoning people or dumbing people down. It is part of weather manipulation to mitigate against things happening in the atmosphere. That is not to deny the other story, because spraying vapor over human populations to poison them is also part of ancestral story. But the emphasis in the Eden Enigma is to say, okay, I have already talked about really unpleasant traumatic experiences in the past. I want us to see the other side of the picture here and realize that the most recent stories of intervention are actually on the light side. They're actually saying we have very helpful company in the cosmos when we have climate emergencies, when we have planetary catastrophes. And the Tingir would be an example of one of those positive stories. The Biainili, who left behind the carvings and the cuneiform inscriptions, writing in the Iron Age, they all wanted the Tingir to return. And they wanted to create the conditions when Haldi and Alubani and all the others might come back, because their ancestors remembered it as a golden age the last time they were here. And I think that's a message we need to hear, when I think there's a lot of scaremongering still going on with regard to the possibility of contact in the present. And certainly if you hear the possibility of ET contact discussed by politicians in hearings in Washington, it's always that note of existential threat, military security. That's always the background to why we need to know more about this. And in the Eden Enigma, I'm saying there's a whole other side to this story that ought to make us excited and more confident about the potential for a happier human future.
Right on. I like that. Absolutely. That's being the change. Now, when we think about the contact that our space brothers and sisters have most likely made with us in the past and probably will again in the future, wouldn't you think that they've probably, maybe some of these stories about hybrids and sacred bloodlines, etc., like thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, if they created civilization as we know it, instead of them staying here, if they wanted to go somewhere else, would they have maybe created a system where they had, these blood ties, these hybrids, or hybrids, and
Well,
certain levels of power that keep the reins, and keep things in their control grid per se.
Yeah, that is part of ancestral story for sure. My book, The Eden Conspiracy, goes into that in great detail, that talks about these ancient stories. You can listen to the Nigerian story of the Ejisu would be one example, or the biblical stories of the Elohim would be another, or the Sumerian stories leading up to Gilgamesh, another example. These are all examples of stories that say in the past we were governed by non-human others who colonized us in a way very similar to how we colonize each other's countries. And then let's just unpack that analogy. So when we colonize each other's countries, we initially go in physically, in great number with great force, and we overwhelm the country with our military power. And once we have dominance, we provide the police, we provide the army, anybody else is an insurgent and a rebel. Right. We provide the Department of Education. Nobody else is going to tell you what's true. We provide the media. If some other source says there was a massacre over here, don't believe them. That's not the official news. We provide the courts, the legal system, the banks, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But once we have established the commodity prices, the exchange rates, the legal systems that then lock that country into a sort of vassal situation, we can begin to change gears and say, you can now have your own teachers. Locals can now become police, can now become judges. You can have locals running news outlets, etc., etc. And ultimately, we can go home because we're still going to benefit from having power over you and possibly from the natural resources that we are creaming off your economies. That's what we do to each other. And it's possible that something similar was done to us in the past. And the stories I mentioned all have a crossover moment where the governance goes from the non-human others to human kings and queens and presidents. So in the Bible, Saul is the first human king, but it turns out, as I show in the Eden Conspiracy, the non-human others are still pulling strings behind closed doors. They're still interfering in who is king, and they're still creaming off tribute from the human kings. The Ejisu are the non-human others who then hand over to the Oba in Nigeria, but the Oba govern on behalf of the Ejisu. Gilgamesh is the crossover king between the Anunnaki kings and the human kings, and he's a hybrid. So there's your bloodline story, that they're wanting the right kind of person, an amenable kind of person to be governing. And of course, from the dawn of time, the royal family lines are very concerned to maintain the purity of that bloodline so that they're not interbreeding with ordinary human beings. And so strong has that ethic been that we reached the 20th century, and 9 crowned heads of independent countries in Europe were all members of one family. We reached a point in the 1400s, 1500s, where maintaining pure royal bloodlines had produced incredibly deformed people who royal painters had to sort of bend over backwards to try and make look more normal for the royal portraits because all the inbreeding. And so even though this has been managed to the extent that everyone, looks normal and human, this concern with pure royal bloodlines goes on to the present day. And I think it does go back to this moment of handover, the Gilgamesh moment, the Saul moment, when for the first time we humans were allowed to govern ourselves. I think it's a very deep memory of how human civilization emerged.
Do you ever wonder, like maybe just off air even, or, like not publicly, but if there's still meetings that go on between the gods or the ancient ones and today's modern like top level politicians and CEOs, they have to go and meet with the
ET bosses.
Yeah, like whatever name.
Okay.
I want to be very careful what I say. But
all right.
Yeah.
Well, there are two things that make me think that might be the case. One is, for instance, to come back to Turkey and to the Bianili people. They certainly had protocols that they used in their temples or sanctuaries that I argue in the Eden Enigma were intended to broker remote communication with the Tingir. They wanted to govern on behalf of the Tingir, and so they had these protocols which included phenomena of light, electromagnetic activity, special brews to create an altered state of consciousness, so that they could have this communication with these other beings. We see something similar if you go into Mexico and look at what the late Maya were doing of the Jaguar dynasty. They had bloodletting ceremonies that looked really very painful, that the royals had to go through so that they could achieve altered states of consciousness and then communicate with these non-human others and therefore govern on their behalf with their authority. I think there's something similar in the Bible where the priests are in an atmosphere that is absolutely infused with psychoaffective substances so that they can have remote communication from Yahweh and therefore govern on his behalf. So if we go to the ancient past, yes, the VIPs are trying to have appointments with the ETs so that they can govern in the right way. That's part of our ancient story. But to bring it into the present day, I happen to believe Brigadier General Meher, who for 28 years was Israel's chief of space security, when he says we've been in contact with non-human visitors for more than 80 years, and that we have agreements in place with these visitors that relate to some technology sharing, some assistance in us developing our own technology. And once that's been acknowledged, you have to ask, what else are they talking about and who's in on this? He certainly said that we're talking about the privileged aspects of the government of the United States of America and Israel, and he hints that other countries as well. And of course, we had that statement from Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev back in 2008, saying that every new Russian prime minister is given a dossier detailing who we're already in contact with. So, I mean, that's all out there. That's not me. That's all out in the public domain.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take a lot of speculation to think that they might be talking about things other than technology.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, he said specifically that they're on Mars. We're working with them, but they're not ready to make themselves known publicly yet because we don't understand space yet.
Yeah.
Which I think that's
right.
kind of an interesting reason. Like, because
yeah, no, it makes sense. It makes sense because until we can manipulate space-time, which is what that really means, then we are only citizens of Earth. We're not citizens of the cosmos. We're citizens of Earth. We are pre-interstellar species. We are to be visited and studied. We're not members of the club. As soon as we become interstellar in our capabilities, in our own technology, then I think the rules of engagement change. Now, this is what Meher is saying, but it's actually something I'd concluded from my own research before he even said that. And I take it even more seriously now he has said that and been under house arrest ever since.
Has he now? Wow. When he said that, okay, so you probably, I don't know if you saw that declassified CIA file that came out where they did in the 1980s, they did, or it was actually the 90s, they had a team that did a remote viewing session on Mars. They didn't tell them what they were remote viewing, because if you're doing a true remote viewing, you don't know what you're looking at. You know, you're not like, oh, you want me to remote view Mars? Okay. You know, that's you're using your imagination there. They just give them a little piece of paper and they tell them what to look at. And these dudes remote viewed Mars about 1 million years ago. Cydonia, the region of Cydonia, the coordinates tagged Cydonia. They described it to a T, and then they described, they had them go further into the future. And the civilization was basically underground in these chambers to give them life extension, because they were waiting for their people to get back, because they had to go off planet to find another habitable civilization, or another place that they could build a civilization. So, and then Total Recall came out just a few years after that. That remote viewing session. Actually, I'm sorry, it was in the 80s when it came out. But anyway, make a long story short, they described these people on Mars as tall and skinny, kind of like what you said. And I wonder if they came from Mars. Have you ever thought about that? Like, Mars was the spot, and then it got blown to smithereens, so they jumped to Mars and they came to Earth?
I have thought about that, and I've thought about that mainly from an archaeological viewpoint, really. There are people who say they can find hints of this in ancestral story. I haven't yet seen that myself, but just looking at what we're being shown, it looks like a post-apocalyptic environment, doesn't it? And there are lots of anomalous objects that we're finding there that again suggest there was something here and something happened. So the story you're telling makes sense to me. And I think our ancestors didn't have the problems we have when it comes to telling stories of visitors from other planets who may have been on Mars previously, who may have used it as a staging post. Somehow in the 21st century, when you start saying things like that out loud, people think either science fiction or lunatic. But I am just watching this space, because I think we are going to find more and more on Mars that is going to build up a picture that says there was a civilization here before, and it looks very much like a human civilization. In fact, it looks very much like us.
Oh yeah, yeah. And then the fall, they refer to them as fallen angels in the Book of Enoch. Have you cross-referenced any of those names, or any of the, like, where do you think they came from?
Well, the Book of Enoch is really interesting because it's kind of a crossover book almost between the biblical canon and the Mesopotamian canon.
Yeah.
We have a reference in the Bible in Genesis 6 to these beings, these non-human beings who come and hybridize with human beings. And they produce Nephilim. They produce these people who are born a normal size, but never stop growing. They become giants. And that's the story of Genesis 6. That has a parallel in the Enuma Elish, where we've got the Igigi who come for some shore leave, and it seems to suggest a similar sequence of events.
Yeah.
And Igigi, this means observers. Huh. So in the Sumerian, we've got observers coming, and then there's this hybridization thing that happens. And in the Book of Enoch, the beings who come and do the hybridizing are called the Watchers, which I find a bit of a coincidence. Watchers, observers. Yeah. And they are coming from stations in the sky. So this is the phrase used in the Babylonian text, from their stations in the sky, which again, with the 21st century mind, it's not difficult to picture that. It could mean planets, it could mean stars, but it also could mean artificial structures in the sky. across all these stories, what's interesting is there's some kind of a, what's the word for it? A law, an agreement that says there must be no contact of this kind, and it's breached, and it creates a terrible controversy among the non-human others oversighting Project Earth. And you can go further afield, and that controversy, the note of controversy is there. It's there in the Norse story. It's there in the Greek story as well. These advanced beings should not be interfering with a, what, pre-technological, pre-interstellar species, and certainly should not be breeding with them. And so it's not just the breeding aspect that repeats from culture to culture. It's the idea that this has breached an agreement that was binding together the non-human forces who felt they were stakeholders in Project Earth. And I think that's a really interesting little detail to keep repeating.
It would make one hell of a love story if they put that aspect in it. Like they just fell in love, you know, it was just all about love. They're like, man, we're going to be in big trouble, but we're in love with these Earth women. What are we going to do?
Well, yeah, I love that is there in the Genesis telling of the story, because it says that those who came down found Earth women hot. That's what it says. Found them beautiful. I think they did fall in love with them. And you can understand that, you know, so a few Agigi needing some shore leave makes sense.
We've all been there. Yeah, we all have our caveats, but I wouldn't call them fallen angels.
No, it's a really unfortunate phrase, that, because people think they've said something when they use that language, but they haven't, because the word angel does not tell you what kind of entity you're looking at. Angel just means messenger or agent or deputy. Doesn't tell you any more than that. And fallen, what does that mean? It means they've come from the sky. But you use the words fallen angels because we've had a couple of thousand years of Christian religion, for instance. Mm-hmm. We think we're being told something spiritual and moral that should get our hackles up. And I have correspondence with a lot of people whose sort of go-to is anything extraterrestrial must be demonic, right? Because they're fallen angels, aren't they? Well, what do you mean by that? And no. And it leads people to a really crazy worldview. It really baffles me, the number of people who suggest to me that planet Earth has human beings on it, and every other planet in the universe is populated by demons. What kind of God would you have to believe in to come up with a universe like that? Is that the universe you live in, for Pete's sake? Where to start if that's the universe that someone lives in? It's really sad, but you can see how people get there through this distortion of language.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We agree on that 100%. And as I tell people sometimes in the comment section, if I'm doing an interview and somebody's talking about ETs and they say, "Oh, ETs are demons," and I write back, well, maybe that's what they think about humans. You know, like, I mean, because there's some good people out there, but then there's definitely not. So there's some very bad apples out there. No, that's brilliant. I love that. My theory is, and I'll just throw this out there, I wonder if that's where the watchers that are referred to came from, is Mars. Like that's something that I've thought about for a long. I could be way off, and it's kind of like that gut thought that comes in, you know, gut feeling that I get sometimes. But anyway, that's it's very
possible. Yeah, it is possible. I do think someone was on Mars.
Cool. Get your ass back.
And what a crazy year, though, because I mean, we've had this really interesting information that's been revealed that strongly suggests life on Mars. Mm-hmm. We've had a recent incident where on film missiles have bounced off a UFO. If this wasn't 2025, this would be huge news, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But we've just got too much human crazy going on in 2025 years for people to realize what has just been announced.
Oh yeah. So let's talk about that. What do you see 3I Atlas being? What is your theory on that?
I don't have a theory, to be honest, at the moment. I'm just watching that space. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so 5% chance it's a spacecraft, 95% chance it's just a really old, ancient interstellar comet that's really cool, and we don't know how to explain it. But it is fast. I mean, it's fascinating. Regardless, it seems like there's a lot of stuff in signs in the heavens that are kind of linking up to some of these past events that took place a long time ago when major, like, you look for the signs in the heavens. It doesn't have to be alien to be cool or to be a sign for something spiritual.
No, that's right. Absolutely. And we learn so much about the cosmos when objects turn up in our local space. Yeah. And there's a lot of work going on at the moment to try and get a sense of life in the cosmos. Is it an exception on planet Earth, or is it the norm? And so when objects like this come into the solar system, there's a lot of study that goes on to assess, is there life on it? Are there proteins on it? Is there any sign that this has come from a populated quadrant of the cosmos? Our astrophysicists are actually very interested in those questions and open to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So cool. And okay, so I forgot to ask you this. You talk about a light gate? Yes,
that's right. So Meher Capi in Van City is a fascinating example of a light gate. It's carved into a limestone cliff. It's about 1,300 meters above sea level. It's 5 meters tall. It's triple inset door. So a huge effort has gone to creating this. And the story is that this is a gate for Haldi. So this goes back to the desire of the Urartian people for the Tingir, Haldi and the Tingir, to come back. And they believed that they would always come back through a bright doorway. And at all the citadels, when you read the cuneiform inscriptions, the kings say, I created the citadel, I created an agricultural revolution, and I also built doorways for Haldi so that he can come back. So what is a bright doorway, and why did they think Haldi would come back through one of those? Initially, when I heard the story of the Tingir arriving in a beam of light, I thought, oh, this sounds like Star Trek. You know, this is a beaming system. They're coming in on a beam of light. And I related it to Celtic story of the Fae, the Shay, the Siths, as we would call them, coming in on beams of light. And I wondered if it was a story like that. But these are doorways. These are not beams of light that they're depicting. And I made some other connections when my friend David Lovegrove, of Viking superpowers fame, told me the story of King Svedgr. And King Svedgr is an ancient Norse story of a king who suddenly finds on his land this huge object that he doesn't know what it is. And the writers struggled to describe it. They said it was like a huge pebble, but the size of a house. And then a doorway opens in it, and a small being comes out about the size of a year 6. And King Svedgr goes to the being and then walks with the being through the doorway back into the pebble and is never seen again. This sounds like a craft. Now imagine what happens if you've got a craft that lands in a pre-technological era and a door opens. You are going to see a beam of light shining out from it because they've got artificial lighting, which would have been an absolute revelation to the people back then. And the beings would walk out of that beam of light. And then when they went home, they'd walk back into that beam of light. So these bright doorways would always be remembered as that's the Tingir. They come and go through these bright doorways. And I think that the creation of Meher Capi and others like it were evocations of stories like that. And it was of a cultural memory of advanced others who had artificial lighting and who, whenever they came in their craft, would walk out of them in a bright beam of light. And I think that the Bianili, when they created the doorways, are doing a couple of things possibly. One, they're just telling the story. This is a commemoration. But it might be that they're telling the story to try and remind the Tingir that they really want to come back, don't they, and share some more technology. but they did other things as well to try and create the conditions in which they would return. And when we get to the sanctuaries of the Urartian installations, there's a lot of evidence to do with the materials used, the orientation of the sanctuary spaces, that what they were trying to do was to create an environment filled with light, because they believed that would lead to contact with the Tinjir.
Okay. So they wanted to get those conditions the same. That way, that's their best shot of making contact again. Totally makes sense. I think that's, I mean, yeah, absolutely. That's what you do in a laboratory, right? If you're trying to get certain results, you're going to go and you're going to have certain formulas that you're going to use. That's really cool.
I think so. I think so. So they use orientation to channel sunlight. They use alabaster to absorb the light. They put gold leaf over the alabaster to reflect the light. So they're doing everything they can to create the most intense light experience they know how to do with the technology of the day.
They're trying to mimic the sun almost.
Yeah, and they're trying to mimic artificial lighting.
Here's a very interesting question. So what is your, and this is from the chat, what is your opinion of the biblical stories having evidence here in the USA and not just in places like the Middle East? Is there any evidence of that?
Is there a for instance that comes with that? What kind of stories are we thinking?
Well, just like a lot of the biblical stories and the Sumerian stories, it seems like they're referencing events that took place in that part of the world. Are there?
Yes. Well, okay. I think there are some locations that get more mention in ancestral story than others. The Middle East is certainly one of those places. Anatolia is certainly another. Other parts of the world, I think, can be more puzzling because I think we really are looking at post-apocalyptic environments. Australia would be one of those, as it happens. I mean, when I first came to Australia and started traveling, oh my goodness, it was such a feeling in my gut of what in the world happened here. Because you know something immense happened here at some point to deeply, deeply damage the environment. And then Australia, as we know it, is the recovery. And you see it in the megafauna, and you also see it in the landscape. And I think something could be said along those lines for North America as well. Not quite to the same extent, but when we go back to, for instance, the Clovis comet conversation we were having earlier, in North America, 70% of the megafauna were extincted by one great hit of something. And it seems to be associated with sky fires around the northern half of the world, which you find in the sedimentary layer when you start digging down into the soil. And it's called the Clovis comet because it was in association with archaeology being done that was surfacing evidence of a Clovis civilization. So this means an advanced human civilization on the continent of North America that was virtually obliterated. And if there are any signs of that are anything more than micro signs, well, those will be in protected areas where you and I won't be allowed to go. I think there is a little bit of that that's happening. I think there are stories to be told with regard to the deep history of North America. We're not in a position quite yet to be able to tell those stories because I think so much is under wraps, and in particular evidences around the Grand Canyon. So it may be that those are the stories that were in the mind of the person who put that question forward. I'm not sure. If they want to shoot a follow-up question and say what the for instance is they're thinking of, I'm happy to have a go at that. But those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Absolutely. Grand Canyon. Wow. It's called the Grand Canyon for a reason. It is amazing. Have you been?
I have been. I have mule trekked down a section of it.
Nice.
And it was, a wonderful, wonderful experience. I wish I could go again and see more. Maybe in the future I will.
Well, hey, you can go with me and my friend Shondell. He's Navajo, so we can get on the Navajo land
Oh,
where
awesome. Excellent.
you'll
I
be
look forward
overlooking
to that.
the ISIS tower. It's called ISIS Tower, which is so beautiful and majestic, man. I could talk for hours about the spiritual experiences I've had out there. We've had some amazing experiences. Shondell knows what happened because he was there. But so let me ask you a question about Turkey. What was the most, this is just, I got to know, what is the coolest thing that you have discovered out there that just made you go, wow?
The coolest thing that we discovered, I think, I've got to mention a couple. Well, one is the evidence, the evidence of an explosion at Chavez Tepe. I think I find absolutely mind-bending to find these fragments in an area of Chavez Tepe that clearly was obliterated by something. That's phenomenal. Also, the destruction at Kefkalesi is very similar. When you go up to Kefkalesi and you see what's left, it's just the most impacting thing to stand there and think, where's everything else? What in the world happened here? But on my recent visit to Turkey, I think one of the highlights for me doing this film shoot with Matthew LaCroix was working with Tashin Ceylan. And he's a name not perhaps widely known in the States, but you might know the name of David Attenborough. Yeah. You might know the name of Jacques Cousteau, and Tashin Ceylan is up there. He is a guy like that. And I sat down with him one day during the film shoot. He is just the most brilliant underwater photographer. He made a discovery under the waters of Lake Van, which we dived and examined. We were the first team to examine this artifact that he discovered in 2018, which was a wonderful coup. You'll see it in Matt LaCroix's movie. And I was really excited that Tashin was our dive master. And I said to Tashin, when I was a little boy, I used to watch Jacques Cousteau, and we could see it in color on our color TV. It was the first color TV program I ever watched. The whole world was glued to his movies because he was showing us the underwater world in a way that we had never seen before. And it was absolutely electrifying. He introduced me to your world, Tashin, your world of underwater photography. And he absolutely beamed when I told him that story. And he took out his phone and he showed me a photograph he had taken of Jacques Cousteau because he had worked with Jacques Cousteau. He was a member of Jacques Cousteau's underwater society, and they were very, very close associates. Nice. And for me suddenly to realize, oh my goodness, I was sitting next to someone who worked with Jacques Cousteau, who was so much a part of my boyhood and so much a part of what gave me a curiosity for the world. It was like sitting next to Jacques Cousteau himself. And to have him looking after us on this dive, showing us this artifact that had never been studied before, this was unbelievable. It was really, really magical.
Oh, man. You got a pretty cool gig. Being able to go and explore all these places, you know?
It's exciting work. It really is cool.
That's awesome. Well, so what's next for you?
Oh, gosh. What's next is Matt and I are leading a tour in a few days' time. So to share these sites with other people, and we will do some more tours next year as well. We've got 30 people signed up for this first tour, which is awesome. Yeah. I'm working on a screenplay at the moment, so pulling together some collaborators to make that happen. Nice. I'm working on a book in collaboration with Mauro Bellino. He is an Italian Bible scholar, and it's very interesting because his and my stories are so different. He comes from a different country. He's an agnostic. I come from a Christian background, but we have both applied much of our life to studying the Hebrew scriptures and the Bible in general. And as we've drilled down into the meaning of the key words, we have reached very, very similar conclusions. totally different to the stories we usually extract from the Bible. So we're writing a book together about our respective journeys and the conclusions we've reached. So that's in the pipeline to be released early 2026. And I'm really excited about a new online learning community that we're creating. For many years, I did person-to-person coaching, one-on-one coaching, and I had to give it up due to over demand, really. But I was working with people who are veterans of war, scientists, academics, pastors, all kinds of people all around the world, people who've had close encounter experiences, people who found things in ancient texts, people who found things through archaeological work. And I was doing a lot of personal coaching that enriched my research path, as well as hopefully help the people I was coaching. But I've now had to move it onto a group coaching footing. And so we're creating an online learning community called Ancient Knowledge Academy. And it will be more affordable than my coaching was. And it means that there are groups of us who are on learning journeys together. And it will be all the kinds of territory that I've covered in the Eden series, on The Fifth Kind, on YouTube, on the Paul Wallis channel. Anyone interested in human origins, human potential, our place in the cosmos, Ancient Knowledge Academy, that's the learning community for you. So we're busy setting that up, and we'll be launching that in 2 or 3 weeks from now.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Well, let me know how I can help with that or with anything you've got going on. I'd be happy to. Super honored to speak with you. And I'm going to leave links in the video description box so people can get access to your work and to your website and your amazing podcasts. And, you know, Morrow, I did an interview with him and Gerald Clark, and I think Matthew was involved in this too. Like 8 years ago, we all did a roundtable together.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. And I haven't talked to him since. So if you would be kind enough to tell him I said hello, that would be much appreciated.
I will say good day.
He used to be a translator for the Vatican. Like he was doing translations and stuff, if I remember.
Yes, he was doing translations for Edizione San Paolo and for interlinear texts, which has to be very, very precise renderings of the Hebrew with no interpretation. You've really got to be on top of what the root meanings of all these words were. And you just leave it as intact as possible so that the scholar can really see what's going on in the original text without being clouded by later interpretation. And Edizione San Paolo, their chief client was the Vatican. And so it was very exacting, but what was interesting was there was some tension ultimately between the story that the Vatican wants to tell through its literature and what's actually in the text. And that tension is a very important part of Mauro's story.
Oh man, your guys' book's probably gonna be a blockbuster.
That's the plan.
That's what I'm talking about. Two awesome minds together. Wow. Well, exactly. I'll tell you what, folks, if you want to get a good series, I'm going to show off one more time. I want to show off your book here, the most recent, The Eden Enigma. Share the screen here. Boom. You can get it on Amazon and I'm sure many other places. This is it right here. Almost all 5 stars. Leave a review and pick up the series. I think this is like your 6th book in the
Eden. That's right. 6th in the Eden series.
That's what I'm talking about. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. How cool is that? You know, and in finishing, I got to say, my friend Chris that I grew up with, like we were best friends in middle school and for a little while in high school. And then we ended up moving away and not talking to each other for 30 years. But we've made contact again and we're friends again, like we never missed a beat. And he's like, oh man, I saw you did an interview with Paul Wallis. That's so cool. I'm like, yeah, well, guess what? I'm going to be talking to him again. He's like, really? So he'll be happy to hear this as well. And then seeing
awesome.
Yeah, man. He's you know what? He was in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's retired.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Well, look, I would love to talk to Chris. So tell him to reach out to me. We can have a conversation.
So cool. So cool. Well, it's been an honor, and I hope you have a beautiful day out there in the land down under. And thank you, Paul. It was really nice to speak with you.
Thanks, Brett. It's been a pleasure, and I'll look forward to next time.
Right on. Thank you, everybody. Right. Me too. Have a beautiful day. Be excellent to each other. Hit the bell. Be well. And remember, be the change you want to see.